The unmarked letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by hand rather than post. Inside was a single page bearing NASA's insignia alongside the Department of Defense's eagle, an unusual pairing that made my stomach tighten. The directive was brief: report to Facility 13, Groom Lake, Nevada. Even through the clinical language, I understood what it meant: Area 51. No mission brief, just coordinates and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to double as a weapon. If you choose to decline, the accompanying note read, destroy these documents and forget this conversation ever happened. The consequences for breaching confidentiality weren't spelled out. They didn't need to be. The red eye to McCarran was nearly empty. I kept expecting someone to stop me, to reveal this was all an elaborate hoax. Instead, I found myself on the tarmac of a private airstrip where a black Suburban waited, its engine idling in the pre-dawn chill. The driver could have been cast from a government agent mold: crew cut, black suit, reflective sunglasses despite the darkness. "Dr. Carter," he said, not a question. He opened the rear door without another word. As we sped north on unmarked roads, I watched Vegas shrink in the side mirror, its neon glow fading like a dying star. The radio stayed off. The only sound was the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional crackle of the driver's encrypted radio. "First time to the facility?" he finally asked, breaking hours of silence. "That obvious. You haven't stopped fidgeting with your watch since we left McCarran." A pause. "You won't be needing it where we're going." Signs began appearing along the highway. Warning: restricted area. Use of deadly force authorized. Photography prohibited. Some showed bullet holes, whether from frustrated tourists or government warning shots, I couldn't tell. "Janet Airlines," the driver said suddenly. "Excuse me?" "The plane that usually brings in personnel. Locals call them Janet Airlines, just another non-existent terminal. You got the VIP treatment with the private flight." I appreciated his attempt at small talk, but it only heightened my anxiety. The facility emerged from the desert haze like a mirage, a sprawling complex of hangars and buildings that seemed to defy conventional architecture. The perimeter fence wasn't just barbed wire, it was a modern fortress wall bristling with sensors, cameras, and what looked like sonic deterrent systems. At the first checkpoint, guards with MP5s conducted a thorough search of the vehicle. One studied my credentials with unnerving intensity, his flashlight beam lingering on my face. "Quantum physics, huh?" he said, handing back my ID. They must be getting desperate. 3 more checkpoints followed, each more rigorous than the last. By the time we reached the main facility, I'd been photographed, scanned, and had my retinas mapped twice. The concrete building they led me to looked deliberately mundane, like a government office from the 1960s. Inside, a security team efficiently stripped me of everything connecting me to the outside world: phone, watch, wallet, even my belt. In exchange, I received a badge marked Level 4 Access and a grey jumpsuit that felt like it had been woven from classified documents. Dr. Everett Cole met me in the corridor, his lab coat pristine despite the desert dust that seemed to coat everything else. He was older than I expected, with sharp eyes that suggested he'd seen things that defied explanation. "Welcome to Project Karen," he said, extending his hand. "I've read your papers on quantum tunneling. Brilliant work, if a bit conservative in its conclusions." "Conservative is safer," I replied. "Not anymore." He gestured for me to follow. "What we're doing here, what you'll be part of, throws safe out the window." We passed doors marked with cryptic designations: Experimental Propulsion Lab Delta, Xenobiological Containment, Quantum Variance Testing. Each required different levels of clearance, their security panels glowing with colors I'd never seen used in traditional access systems. "That's where they kept the Roswell artifacts," Cole said casually, pointing to a heavily fortified door. "Until we understood they weren't artifacts at all. Before I could process that bombshell, we reached a door requiring dual biometric authentication. The security panel looked more advanced than anything I'd seen in my years of government work. "Ready to see why we brought you here?" Cole asked, placing his palm on the scanner. The room beyond defied comprehension. Massive holographic displays covered the walls, showing data streams that seemed to loop in on themselves in impossible ways. But it was the structure in the center that drew my attention. A ring of metal that had to be 30 feet in diameter, covered in symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. "My God," I whispered. "Not quite," Cole said, a hint of dark humor in his voice. "But we're getting closer to understanding them." The air around the ring rippled like heat waves over hot asphalt, but the temperature in the room was a carefully controlled 68 degrees. Something about the distortion made my teeth ache. "This," Cole said, "is the future, assuming we can control it. And if we can't?" He turned to me, his expression grave. "Then it might be the end of everything we know. That's why you're here, Dr. Carter. We need someone who understands that some doors once opened can never be closed." The briefing room looked like it had been transplanted from a more conventional facility. Standard government-issue chairs arranged in a semicircle, fluorescent lighting that hummed just on the edge of hearing. But small details betrayed its true nature. The strange metal alloy of the walls, the faint blue glow emanating from seemingly sourceless points in the corners, the way sound seemed to die a few feet from its source. "Anyone seen Roberts?" Dr. Cole asked as he entered, his footsteps oddly muted on the polished floor. "She was supposed to be here for the quantum metrics review." Dr. Bennett, a younger researcher with perpetually disheveled hair, cleared his throat. "Medical quarantine. Something about temporal displacement symptoms after last week's resonance test." Cole's expression tightened. "Right. Well, let's begin." The lights dimmed automatically, and a holographic projection materialized in the center of the room. The portal rotated slowly in the air, every detail rendered with unsettling clarity. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift when viewed directly, like optical illusions that refused to resolve into meaningful patterns. "What we're about to discuss," Cole began, "violates everything you think you know about physics. Dr. Carter, you've written extensively about quantum tunneling. Dr. Bennett, your work on dark matter propulsion is groundbreaking. Dr. Alvarez," he nodded to a woman with sharp features and tired eyes, "your theories about dimensional boundaries were closer to the truth than you could have known." He pressed a button and the hologram changed, showing a cascade of equations that made my head hurt. Project Karen began in 1947, though we didn't know it at the time. The Roswell incident wasn't about crashed UFOs, it was about mathematics. Equations carved into a material we still can't identify, describing something we're only now beginning to understand. "The portal isn't just a doorway," he continued. "It's a bridge between realities. We've designated the space beyond as dimension theta, though that's like trying to describe a hurricane by calling it a breeze." Dr. Alvarez leaned forward, her pen scratching against a notepad. "You said realities, not locations. Are we talking about parallel universes?" "No." Cole's voice was flat. "What lies beyond isn't parallel to anything. It's perpendicular to everything." The hologram shifted again, showing grainy footage that made several researchers gasp. The sky was wrong, a sickly green that seemed to pulse with internal light. Black spires rose from the ground like the fingers of buried giants, their surfaces reflecting light in ways that defied physics. In the distance, shapes moved that the camera seemed unable to focus on properly. "This was captured by Probe 7, Cole explained. "Of the 15 probes we've sent through, it's one of only 3 that transmitted data back. The atmosphere is breathable technically. Gravity registers at 1.1 times Earth normal. Temperature hovers around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything seems almost deliberately habitable." "Almost like it's waiting for us," Dr. Bennett muttered. Cole shot him a sharp look. "Choose your words carefully, Doctor. Anthropomorphizing what we're dealing with is dangerous." "What about life signs?" I asked, studying the footage. "Those movements in the background." "We'll get to that," Cole interrupted quickly, too quickly. "First, let's discuss the energy readings. Dr. Carter, this is where your expertise comes in." He brought up a new set of data, wavelength analyses, quantum state measurements, energy signatures that looked like fever dreams rendered in mathematics. "The portal requires enormous power to maintain, But it's not just about raw energy. It's about resonance, the right frequency, the right quantum state, the right harmony. Harmony? Dr. Alvarez raised an eyebrow. That's an odd choice of words for a physics project. Is it? Cole pressed another button, and sound filled the room, a low, pulsing tone that made my teeth vibrate. This is what the portal sounds like at the quantum level. Listen carefully. The sound shifted, became more complex. Patterns emerged. Not random noise, but something structured, something musical. My God, Bennett whispered. It's like it's singing, I finished. Cole nodded grimly. Now you're beginning to understand. The portal isn't just a machine we built. It's something that wants to be opened. And what lies beyond, well, that's what we're here to find out, assuming we survive the process. The lights came back up, but the sound lingered in my mind. A quantum melody that seemed to echo from somewhere far beyond normal space and time. As we filed out of the briefing room, I noticed Dr. Alvarez lingering behind, staring at the now dark projector with an expression I couldn't quite read. Dr. Alvarez, I called. Are you all right? She turned slowly, and for a moment, her eyes seemed to reflect that sickly green sky from the footage. Did you notice? She asked quietly. In the background of that probe video, one of those spires. It moved. The lab at night was different. During the day, the bustle of technicians and the constant hum of equipment created an illusion of normalcy. But at 2 a.m., with only the glow of monitors and the distant thrum of backup generators, the true nature of the place emerged. I sat at my workstation surrounded by holographic displays showing quantum variance readings. The numbers didn't make sense. They should have made sense. I'd spent 15 years studying quantum physics, written papers that changed how we understood particle entanglement, but these readings... Coffee? I jumped. Dr. Alvarez stood in the doorway, holding 2 steaming cups. She looked as exhausted as I felt. Thanks, I said, taking one. Can't sleep either. Haven't really tried. She pulled up a chair, studying my displays. The containment field readings. Yeah, look at this pattern. I highlighted a section of data. Every 6.28 hours, there's a spike in quantum entanglement. Almost exactly 2 pi hours. That can't be a coincidence. Nothing about this place is coincidental. I rubbed my eyes. Did you know we're built on top of an older facility? I found references in the archived files, something called Project Looking Glass in the 60s. They were trying to... The monitors flickered. We both froze. The coffee in my cup rippled, tiny concentric circles spreading outward. The portal, dormant and dark since the morning's tests, began to shimmer. Are we running any scheduled tests? Alvarez asked, her voice tight. I checked the logs. Nothing. Systems in standby. I hit the intercom. Control, this is Dr. Carter. We're getting unauthorized activity in the portal lab. Static answered. The symbols etched into the portal's surface began to glow, not with their usual blue-white light, but with a sickly green luminescence that reminded me of the sky in the probe footage. The air grew thick, heavy with a charge that made my skin crawl. We should alert Dr. Cole, Alvarez said, reaching for the emergency phone. Wait. I held up a hand. Look at the quantum readings. The displays were alive with impossible data. The entanglement patterns had shifted, forming complex fractals that seemed to fold in on themselves. But it was the frequency analysis that made my blood run cold. It's the same pattern, I whispered, the same song from the briefing, but reversed. A low hum filled the room, building in intensity until I could feel it in my bones. The portal's surface rippled like mercury, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in the distortion. A face, or what might have been a face, if faces could exist in more than 3 dimensions. Dr. Carter, Alvarez said slowly, what's that on your display? I looked at the screen she was pointing to. Among the streams of data, a sequence of numbers repeated. 47, 61, 74, 65, 77, 61, 79. It's ASCII, Alvarez said. It spells gateway. I finished. The word felt wrong in my mouth, like speaking in a language I'd never learned. The portal pulsed once, violently, sending a shockwave that knocked us both back. Equipment crashed to the floor and warning klaxons began to blare. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The portal went dark, the hum faded, and the displays returned to normal. Dr. Cole burst into the lab, followed by a security team in full tactical gear. "What happened?" he demanded. "Who activated it?" "No one," I said, showing him the logs. "It activated itself, or something on the other side." "Don't," Cole snapped. "Don't anthropomorphize it. This was an equipment malfunction, a power surge, nothing more." But his face was ashen, and his hands shook slightly as he reviewed the data. "Sir," one of the security team called, "you need to see this." On the floor in front of the portal, the polished concrete had changed. In a perfect circle, the surface had crystallized, forming patterns that mimicked the symbols on the portal itself. When I looked at them directly, they seemed to shift and move, like living things trapped under glass. "Quarantine the lab," Cole ordered. "No one comes in or out without level 5 clearance." He turned to me. "Dr. Carter, Dr. Alvarez, this conversation never happened. The official record will show a routine power fluctuation, nothing more. Understood?" We nodded, but as we left the lab, I caught Alvarez's eye. She'd pulled out her notepad and was sketching something, the patterns from the floor, but there was something wrong about her drawing. The lines seemed to extend beyond the paper's edges, creating impossible angles that hurt to look at. "It's not random," she whispered. "None of it is random. It's trying to tell us something." "Or warn us," I said. "Probe recovery protocol initiated at 0900 hours, Dr. Bennett announced, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Beginning retrieval sequence for Probe 7. The recovery chamber resembled a NASA cleanroom crossed with a containment vault. Triple-layered isolation fields hummed around the portal, creating a shimmer in the air like heat waves. The robotic retrieval arm, a marvel of engineering that cost more than most space missions, extended from its housing, its surface covered in sensors and containment mechanisms. "Quantum stabilization at 97%, I reported, monitoring the readings. No signs of dimensional bleed. Dr. Cole stood behind the safety barrier, arms crossed. "Dr. Alvarez, status of the biological containment protocols." "Green across the board," she replied, though I noticed she was gripping her tablet too tightly. After last night's incident, we were all on edge. The retrieval arm disappeared into the portal's surface. On the monitors, we could see its progress through what the team had started calling the void, the space between our reality and dimension theta. The feed showed only darkness, occasionally broken by flashes of that sickly green light. "Signal from the probe," Bennett called out. "Distance approximately 300 meters through the threshold." "That's impossible," I said, checking the readings. "The probe was only 50 meters in when it stopped transmitting." "It moved," Alvarez whispered. "On its own." Cole shot her a warning look. "Focus on the retrieval, Doctor." The arm's cameras showed the probe emerging from the darkness. It looked wrong somehow. Its smooth surface was now covered in irregular patterns, like frost on a window, but darker. As the arm made contact, our instruments went crazy. "Quantum entanglement spike," I shouted. "The probe's molecular structure is shifting." "Bring it through," Cole ordered. "Now." The arm retracted, pulling the probe back through the portal. As it crossed the threshold, everyone in the room took an involuntary step back. The probe's surface was covered in a black, undulating substance that seemed to absorb light. "My God," Bennett breathed. "What is that?" Dr. Alvarez approached the containment field, her scientific curiosity overtaking her caution. Through the triple-layer barrier, we could see the substance moving, forming complex patterns that reminded me of the symbols on the portal, but organic, flowing. "Getting unusual electromagnetic readings," I reported. "Whatever this substance is, it's generating its own field." Alvarez pulled on a containment suit and entered the sealed chamber. With practiced precision, she took a sample of the black substance, transferring it to a sealed container. Under the microscope feed, we watched in fascination and horror as the material continued to move. forming and reforming patterns that seemed almost deliberate. "This isn't contamination," Alvarez said, her voice tight with excitement or fear. I couldn't tell which. "This is a completely novel form of matter. Look at the molecular structure. It's reconfiguring itself in response to observation." "Like a quantum wave function?" I asked. "No," she replied, "like it's thinking." Suddenly, the sample container cracked. The black substance began to seep through, moving with purpose toward the probe. "Containment breach," Bennett yelled. Alarms blared as emergency protocols activated. "It's not just moving," I said, watching the readings spike. "It's resonating, the same frequency as the portal." The substance reached the probe and spread rapidly across its surface. As it did, the patterns it formed became more complex, more alien. They reminded me of circuit boards, but designed by something that had never seen electricity, never known human logic. "Dr. Alvarez, get out of there now," Cole ordered, but she stood transfixed, watching the transformation. "It's not random," she said, her voice distant. "It's a language, the most basic language in the universe, mathematics, and it's trying to—" The probe shuddered. The black substance pulsed, and for a moment, the patterns aligned perfectly with the symbols on the portal. The air itself seemed to vibrate with that now familiar quantum melody. "Full quarantine," Cole shouted. "Seal the lab." As blast doors slammed shut, I caught a glimpse of something in the portal's surface, a reflection, or maybe a window. Those same towering figures we'd seen in the footage, but clearer now, watching, waiting. The substance had completely engulfed the probe, transforming it into something that hurt to look at directly. And through it all, those patterns kept shifting, kept communicating. It's not just an organism, I realized, horror dawning. It's an interface. The quarantine lab hummed with the sound of air scrubbers and containment fields. Through 3 layers of reinforced glass, we watched the black substance continue its methodical transformation of the probe. The patterns it formed had become more complex, more structured, like a language written in fractals. Dr. Alvarez hadn't spoken since being pulled from the containment chamber. She sat at her workstation, frantically sketching in her notebook. I caught glimpses of her drawings, cascading shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves impossibly. "Your attention, please." Dr. Cole's voice cut through the tense silence. "Dr. Carter, what's the status of the quantum readings?" I studied the displays, trying to make sense of the data streams. "The substance is generating its own quantum field. It's coherent, structured, like a quantum computer, but operating on principles we don't understand." "Show me," Cole demanded. I brought up the holographic display. The quantum patterns danced in the air. Beautiful, terrifying, wrong. "See these resonance patterns? They're matching the portal's frequency exactly. But look here." I highlighted a section of data. "Every few minutes, there's a response from the other side." "What kind of response?" Bennett asked, leaning closer. "It's like a conversation, action and reaction, call and response." I paused, watching a new pattern emerge. "And it's accelerating." Through the containment glass, the black substance had arranged itself into concentric circles on the probe's surface. The patterns pulsed with a faint greenish light, the same sickly hue as the sky in Dimension Theta. "Dr. Alvarez," Cole called, "your analysis." She looked up from her notebook, her eyes unfocused. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The way it moves, like music made visible, like—" "Dr. Alvarez," Cole cut her off sharply. "The analysis." She blinked, seeming to come back to herself. "Right. Yes. The molecular structure is unlike anything we've seen. It's not just adapting, it's evolving." "What?" I asked. Before she could answer, the monitors flickered. Through the observation window, movement caught my eye. The copied version of the GE-1 craft hung in the void beyond the portal, a dark mirror of our own vessel, and in its windows. "They're watching us," Alvarez whispered. The figures were clearer now, tall, impossibly thin forms that seemed to bend space around them. Their movements were fluid, yet wrong, like watching a dance choreographed in 4 dimensions. "Dr. Cole," Bennett called, his voice shaking. "The quantum field, it's expanding." The black substance had begun to move again, but differently now. It flowed like liquid mercury, forming new patterns that seemed to reach toward the containment field. The air grew heavy with static electricity. "Those aren't just patterns," Alvarez said suddenly. "They're blueprints, instructions." She held up her notebook, pages covered in intricate drawings. "I've been trying to decode them. They want to show us something. Something about the nature of space itself." "Shut it down," Cole ordered. "Full containment protocols." "Wait," I said, studying the data. "These quantum signatures, they're identical to the ones we recorded during the portal's first activation, when we thought it was just equipment failure." "It wasn't failure," Alvarez whispered. "It was contact." The black substance pulsed, and for a moment the patterns aligned perfectly with Alvarez's drawings. Through the portal, the figures moved closer, their featureless faces turned toward us with an attention that felt physical, crushing. "Look at the probe," Bennett gasped. The surface had begun to ripple, the black substance flowing like water, but against gravity, defying physics. It formed into thin, crystalline structures that branched and grew before our eyes. The first crack in the containment glass appeared with a sound like ice breaking, a thin silver line that seemed to trace one of the patterns the black substance had formed. For a moment, everyone stood frozen, watching as the crack grew, branching like frozen lightning. "Containment breach imminent," the AI system announced with clinical detachment. 3 minutes to critical failure. "Get the gamma barriers up," Cole shouted, rushing to the control panel. "Initiate Protocol Omega." I watched in horror as more cracks spread across the glass, each one following the same impossible geometries we'd seen in the substance's patterns. The quantum readings were off the scale, the displays showing cascading waves of energy that shouldn't have been possible in our reality. "The barriers aren't responding," Bennett reported, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "The system's locked us out. No, that's not right. Something else is in the system." Alvarez stood at the observation window, pressing her hand against the glass. "Listen," she whispered. "Can't you hear it?" Through the growing web of cracks, a sound emerged. That same haunting melody we'd heard from the portal, but distorted, twisted. It resonated at a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. "Dr. Alvarez, step away from the glass," I shouted, but she didn't move. "The mathematics," she murmured. "It's so perfect, so complete. Our equations are like child's drawings compared to—" The glass shattered. The black substance erupted into the lab like a living tide, flowing with impossible speed and precision. Emergency sirens blared as containment doors began to slam shut, but the substance moved faster, tendrils of it shooting out to seal the exits. "Everyone to the emergency bunker," Cole ordered, grabbing Bennett's arm. "Now!" But Alvarez still hadn't moved from the window. The substance flowed around her feet, forming those same maddening patterns we'd seen before. As I watched, it began to climb her containment suit. "Maria!" I lunged forward, but Cole held me back. "It's too late," he said grimly. The substance had reached her helmet, somehow seeping through the sealed connections. Alvarez turned to us, and her eyes were filled with that same sickly green light we'd seen through the portal. "They want to show us," she said, her voice overlaid with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from human vocal cords. "They want us to understand." Through the portal, the figures had drawn closer. In the copied version of our craft, they moved with deliberate purpose, their elongated forms casting shadows that seemed to bend in ways shadows shouldn't. "What are you?" I called out, not sure if I was addressing Alvarez, the figures, or the substance itself. "We are the architects," Alvarez replied, but it wasn't her voice anymore. "Your species builds with matter. We build with space itself." The black substance had nearly covered her now, transforming her containment suit into something else, a crystalline structure that pulsed with internal light. The patterns it formed were no longer just surface decorations. They seemed to extend inward, folding through dimensions we couldn't perceive. "The portal!" Bennett gasped. "Look!" The quantum field around the portal was fluctuating wildly, its surface rippling like a pond in a storm. The figures on the other side were moving faster now, their forms blurring as they manipulated space in ways our instruments couldn't process. "It was never about crossing between dimensions," Cole said, realization dawning in his voice. "They're not trying to come through, they're trying to remake our space into theirs." Precisely, the thing that had been Alvarez said. Her form was barely recognizable now, the crystalline structures extending outward like branches of a tree. "Your mathematics were close, so close. We simply needed to adjust the equations." The black substance reached the portal, and the symbols etched into its surface began to glow with that same green light. The quantum readings spiked impossibly high, and reality itself seemed to shudder. "Get to the control room," Cole ordered, pushing me toward the emergency exit. "Initiate the failsafe, all of it, now." The path to the control room had become a nightmare of twisted space. The black substance had spread through the facility's ventilation system, forming crystalline growths that bent light in impossible ways. Emergency lights cast prismatic shadows that moved independently of their sources. "The failsafe key," Cole gasped as we ran. "In my office. We need—" "No time," Bennett interrupted, pulling out his own key. "I have secondary authorization." I stared at him. "Since when?" "Since Project Looking Glass." His face was grim. "Some of us, we've seen this before. Different form, same intent. That's why the failsafe exists." The control room door was sealed, covered in a layer of the black substance that pulsed with mathematical patterns. Bennett pressed his hand against the security panel, and arcs of electricity shot through the material, forcing it to retreat. "Carter, take the primary console," Cole ordered as we rushed inside. "Bennett, quantum stabilization. I'll initiate the containment collapse sequence." The control room offered a panoramic view of the lab below. The black substance had transformed it into something alien. Structures that grew and shifted like living crystal, all pulsing with that sickly green light. In the center, the thing that had been Alvarez stood before the portal, her form now a complex lattice of impossible angles. "They're coming through," Bennett warned, watching the readings. "The barrier between dimensions is folding." I typed commands into the console, trying to bring the emergency systems online. "The facility's quantum shielding is failing. Whatever they're doing, it's rewriting the basic laws of space-time in this area." Through the portal, the copied version of our facility was changing, its structure warping to match the alien geometry spreading through our side. The figures moved through it with increasing speed, their movements becoming more frenzied as the barrier between realities grew thinner. "Now, Bennett!" Cole shouted. "The key!" Bennett inserted his key into the failsafe console. Red warning lights began to flash as the facility's fusion reactor initiated its overload sequence. But something was wrong. "The quantum cascade isn't following normal patterns," I reported, watching the readings with growing horror. "The laws of physics, they're different here now. We can't predict how the explosion will behave." "We don't need to predict it," Cole said grimly. "We just need it to be big enough to sever the connection." The thing that had been Alvarez turned its face toward us. The crystalline structures had consumed her completely now, transforming her into a living equation, a bridge between realities. "You cannot stop evolution," it said, its voice a chorus of impossible harmonics. "Your universe is inefficient, incomplete. We will remake it into something perfect." "Like hell you will," Bennett growled and turned his key. The explosion began at the quantum level, a cascading failure of reality itself. The fusion reactor didn't just detonate, it collapsed, taking the surrounding space-time with it. The black substance screamed in frequencies that shouldn't have existed, its patterns fragmenting as the laws of physics reasserted themselves. "The portal!" I shouted over the chaos. "It's not closing!" "Secondary charges," Cole said, pulling me toward the emergency exit. "The whole facility is rigged. This was always a possibility." We ran through corridors that were literally coming apart at the quantum level. The crystalline growths shattered. Behind us, the portal pulsed with blinding energy as the beings on the other side fought against the collapsing barrier between worlds. "They're trying to stabilize it," Bennett called out, checking readings on a portable device, "using our own quantum field against us." "They don't understand," Cole said with grim satisfaction. "Human ingenuity isn't about perfection. It's about knowing when to destroy what we create." The secondary explosions began, each one precisely calculated to disrupt the quantum field holding our reality to theirs. The facility's walls crumbled as dimensional stress tore them apart. Above us, through gaps in the ceiling, the desert night sky seemed to ripple and twist. 3 days after the explosion, I sat in a windowless debriefing room deep beneath the Pentagon. The coffee in front of me had gone cold hours ago, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those patterns, those impossible shapes that had almost unmade our reality. The door opened. Dr. Cole entered, looking aged beyond the mere 3 days that had passed. His right hand trembled slightly as he placed a thick file on the table. Manila folder, red stripes, classified stamps in languages I didn't recognize. "How's Bennett?" I asked. "Still in medical isolation. The temporal displacement symptoms are significant." Cole sat heavily. "He keeps drawing those patterns. The nurses have stopped giving him paper." I nodded, understanding too well. I'd caught myself doing the same thing, absent-mindedly sketching fractals that seemed to extend beyond the edges of reality. And the cleanup team? Finding interesting things in the wreckage, the black substance left. Traces, not active ones, thankfully, but enough to study, to learn from. He opened the file. "That's actually why I'm here." The pages inside weren't the typical government reports I'd expected. They were older, yellowed with age, some dating back to the 1940s. Project Looking Glass, Project Wintermute, Project Karen Alpha, Beta, Omega. "We're not the first," Cole said quietly, "and we won't be the last. They've been reaching out for a long time, Dr. Carter, testing different approaches." He spread out a series of photographs across the table. Each showed a different facility, different technologies, but all attempting the same thing, bridging the gap between our reality and theirs. Some of the images made my head hurt just looking at them. The architecture subtly wrong in ways I couldn't quite identify. "Roswell wasn't about crashed ships," Cole continued. "It was about mathematics. Equations left like breadcrumbs, leading us toward this. Each time we follow the trail, we get a little closer to understanding, and each time we have to burn it all down before that understanding destroys us." "The copied facility," I said, remembering the mirror version of our base visible through the portal. "That wasn't the first time either, was it?" Cole shook his head. "They learn from each attempt, adapt. The copies get more perfect, the transitions more subtle. This time they almost succeeded in creating a stable bridge." "What do they want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "Perfection," Cole said simply. "They see our reality as inefficient, chaotic. They want to reshape it, optimize it, make it run according to their mathematics, their geometry." He laughed bitterly. "Imagine trying to explain color to a blind person, or music to someone who's never heard sound. That's what we are to them, incomplete beings who don't understand what we're missing." He pulled out one final document, a transfer order. "We're rebuilding the facility, not there, obviously, a new location. Better shielding, stronger containment protocols, and we need you to head the research team. After everything that happened, everything we lost." "Because of everything that happened," Cole's expression was grave. "They'll keep trying, Dr. Carter, and each time they'll get closer. We need to understand them better than they understand us. It's the only way we survive." I stared at the transfer order, thinking about Alvarez, about the way she looked at the end, transformed into living mathematics, a bridge between realities, about the patterns that still haunted my dreams, the equations that seemed to whisper at the edge of comprehension. "When do we start?" I asked. Cole smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We already have. Look at the date on that order. I checked the document. The date was 3 weeks from now. Time isn't exactly linear anymore, Cole said, standing. Not after what they did to local space-time. We've got a lot of work to do, Dr. Carter, and not much time to do it in. They're already trying again. As if to emphasize his point, the lights flickered briefly, and in that moment of darkness, I swore I saw patterns in the shadows. Beautiful, terrible patterns that spoke of a universe trying to perfect itself, one reality at a time. Welcome to Project Karen Omega, Cole said. Try not to think too hard about which iteration this is.